Two sisters, two queens, two destinies opposed, yet bound tightly together in the violent current of Tudor history. One bore the name Bloody Mary, at whose mention all of Europe shuddered. The other was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the golden symbol of England's age of glory. But behind these titles lies more than brilliance or stain. It is also a family torn apart by ambition, religion, and power. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, raised in the austere Catholic breath of Spain. Elizabeth, the child born from the stormy marriage between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, steeped in Protestant reform from birth. Two halves of the same father's blood. Yet destiny set them on opposing sides. In a patriarchal society where women were believed to be the weaker sex, both Mary and Elizabeth shattered that prejudice by ascending the throne and seizing a nation's fate. Yet their journeys were not the same one remembered for the flames of heresy, the other praised for victory against Europe's greatest empire. But if we look deeper, it was Mary who cleared the way for Elizabeth to follow, and the two sisters, seemingly so opposed, shared more in common than we often imagine. This is the story of two queens, two symbols, two fragments of tragedy and splendor in the history of England. Mary appeared in Henry VIII's life as a promise. On the morning of February 18th, 1516, at Greenwich, the cry of a newborn echoed through the Tudor palace. Not the prince the court had long awaited, but a princess. Yet in that very moment, to Henry and his wife Catherine of Aragon, it was a miracle. After years of miscarriages and lost children, Mary became proof that they could indeed have an heir. Catherine, a woman of proud Spanish blood, raised her daughter in the image of the powerful queens of her lineage. She wanted Mary not only to embroider and sing like other princesses, but also to master Latin, Greek, strategy, politics, and above all to live and breathe the Catholic faith. From childhood, Mary was a card on Europe's chessboard, promised in marriage to princes and dukes as a diplomatic pawn. Henry VIII, however, looked at his daughter differently. He adored Mary, proudly showing off the child with golden hair and rosy skin like his own. But that love, like everything in the Tudor court, was soon swept away by his greatest obsession, a son to inherit. And from here, Mary's life began to turn down a path of trial. As her father sank deeper into his fixation on the throne and his fateful marriages, in the year 1525, Catherine of Aragon turned 40. For a woman in the 16th century, that was nearly the end of hope for bearing more children. Henry VIII, then just past 30, was utterly consumed by the word heir. He wanted not only one son, but at least two or three to secure the fragile Tudor crown against hostile forces from France, from Scotland, from the Pope, and from the Holy Roman Empire. It was an obsession so great it overshadowed more than 20 years of marital love. Henry began to believe that he was punished by God for marrying the widow of his late brother. He found in Leviticus a verse about that prohibition and took it as proof that his marriage with Catherine was sinful, and therefore God withheld from him a son. In that desperation, one name appeared and pierced Henry's mind: Anne Boleyn. Unlike his earlier mistresses, Anne was not easy. She refused to be merely a lover, rejected the jewels Henry offered, and with her cunning made the king believe that only lawful marriage could give him the heir he craved. Henry was infatuated. He was willing to defy the Pope, to confront all of Europe, to marry Anne. And then Mary's entire world collapsed. The father who once cherished her now forbade her to see her mother unless both accepted the annulment. A teenage girl was forced to choose side with her rejected mother, or kneel to her kingly father. Mary chose her mother, and from that moment, she became a thorn in Henry's eyes. From pampered princess, Mary turned into an illegitimate child overnight. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn was crowned queen, and in September 1533, she gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth. Elizabeth entered the world carrying a bitter message for Henry. Mary was officially pushed aside, making way for a new princess, the child later known to the world as Gloriana. Elizabeth's birth brought short-lived joy to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, but also ushered in the most humiliating years of Mary's life. Everything that once symbolized her power and status, from the title Princess of Wales, banners, medals, to her splendid retinue, was stripped away. At only 17, once the most sought-after princess in Europe, Mary was reduced to a servant in the household of her own half-sister. Imagine that scene: Elizabeth, the infant, hailed as the legitimate heir, while Mary was demoted to lady-in-waiting in the very palace where she had once been the centre. For a fragile young woman, often sick and melancholy, being disowned by her father and forced to acknowledge Anne Boleyn and the newborn Elizabeth as the new rulers of the throne was like a blade cutting into her pride. Then tragedy struck even harder in January 1536. Catherine of Aragon, Mary's steadfast mother, died in solitude at Kimbolton Castle. Henry VIII not only refused Mary a final visit, but also forbade her from attending the funeral. The father who once loved her became her oppressor, and her mother, her sole source of comfort, was gone forever. Mary was more isolated than ever, but with her Catholic faith and the unyielding spirit of her Spanish bloodline, she refused to bow. In Henry's eyes, she was a dangerous pawn. The Catholics wanted to preserve as a counterbalance to the new court. Meanwhile, the tide of fortune turned swiftly only months after Catherine's death. Anne Boleyn lost her head on Tower Green. Accused of adultery and treason, Elizabeth, once the pride of the court, was now cast aside as a bastard child. Yet for Mary, consolation did not last long. To regain her father's favour, she was forced to sign a paper acknowledging herself as a bastard child and to accept Henry as the head of the Church of England. A decision Mary regretted until the end of her life, for it both betrayed her Catholic faith and erased the identity she once held. The price of that concession was only a little warmth from her father and the chance to return to court, but Mary knew well from now on, she would only be a shadow, living in humiliation, waiting for destiny to shift again. In the autumn of 1537, Henry VIII's lifelong dream finally came true. Queen Jane Seymour, his third wife, gave birth to a son at Hampton Court. The child was named Edward, and in an instant, the eyes of the entire Tudor court turned to the red-faced infant in the cradle, the one destined to be the saviour star of the young dynasty. Mary and Elizabeth, two princesses once exalted, suddenly became shadows in the great feast of celebration. To Henry, daughters were only daughters. Edward was the son. Yet ironically, Edward's arrival brought a strange pause for the two sisters. With the throne secured by a legitimate heir, both Mary and Elizabeth were no longer seen as immediate threats. They were allowed back to court, and at times even spent more time together. Mary, now grown, began to reacquaint herself with palace life. Though still forced by her father to accept her illegitimacy, she regained some standing, especially as Jane Seymour, a gentle and kind queen, treated her with warmth. Elizabeth, still a little girl, also received an increase. Only 9 years old, was officially crowned King of England. A boy became king, and naturally, real power fell into the hands of the regents. The frightening truth was that Edward, though young, carried a fervent Protestant zeal. As soon as he ascended, the court accelerated religious reform, abolishing Catholic rites and enforcing the English prayer book. For Mary, a steadfast Catholic, this was nothing less than a direct assault on her deepest faith. The arguments between Mary and Edward became legendary. On one Christmas, the siblings quarreled fiercely over the celebration of Mass. The entire court stood aghast as the princess raised the Tudor house. From then on, Mary understood to hold her faith. She would have to oppose not only her father and her stepmothers, but now also her own brother, the king whom the court hailed as the reformer. In the summer of 1553, the Tudor court was shaken once more. King Edward VI, only 15 years old, fell gravely ill. Tuberculosis consumed the young king's body, making every breath a desperate gasp. For Mary, it was a paradoxical moment. Her brother was near death, yet fate was bringing her closer to the throne than ever. Edward knew well if Mary succeeded, all the Protestant reforms he had enforced would vanish. Thus, on his deathbed, he wrote his own device for the succession, an unlawful document excluding both Mary and Elizabeth from inheritance. Instead, Edward named Lady Jane Grey, a distant cousin, only 16 years old, famed for her piety and from a staunch Protestant line. When Edward breathed his last on July 6th, 1553, the secret was kept for days. The nation did not know the king was dead. In the shadow of conspiracy, Jane Grey was forced to wear the crown, becoming the 9-day Queen of England, a fragile pawn in the hands of the Duke of Northumberland, then the most powerful man at court. But Mary was no fool. From her residence in East Anglia, she acted at once. Secret messages from court warned her of plans to arrest her on her way to London. Mary changed course. Within weeks, Mary commanded a mighty army, ready to march on London. Meanwhile, in the capital, Jane Grey sat trembling in the tower. No cheers greeted her. No crowd celebrated, only a heavy silence. And when Northumberland left London to block Mary, even the Privy Council turned, declaring Mary the rightful queen. On July 19th, 1553, only 13 days after Jane had been proclaimed, the unfortunate young girl was stripped of her crown. Mary Tudor, eldest daughter of Henry VIII, who had endured so many years of humiliation, now officially became Queen Mary I of England. The sight of her entrance into London was unforgettable. Mary, dressed in a purple cloak, regal and majestic, riding on horseback, with Elizabeth behind her, tall, youthful, radiant, like an opposing shadow, but also proof of the strength of Tudor blood. The crowds cheered, hung banners, laid carpets of flowers. A new reign had begun. Mary believed this was the sign that God had chosen her to restore the Catholic faith, to bring England back into Rome's embrace. But few could have foreseen that from this moment of glory, the path leading her to the nickname Bloody Mary had also begun. From the first day she sat upon the throne, Mary revealed her iron resolve to return England to Catholic faith. Her Coronation, on October 1st, 1553, was a traditional Catholic Mass, a declaration, as if to proclaim to all the realm that the Protestant wind under Edward had been but a passing discord, and now England was back on its true path. Mary saw the crown not only as political responsibility, but as a sacred mission. She believed God had shielded her through years of disgrace, so that she could now become the warrior queen defending the Roman Church. In her eyes, every policy, every decision had to serve one goal: the revival of Catholicism. But to achieve this, Mary needed something else: a husband, and more importantly, a child. Without an heir, the throne would soon fall to Elizabeth, her Protestant sister, and so all her effort to restore the faith would collapse in a single generation. Mary chose Philip of Spain, prince of the Habsburg dynasty, heir to an empire stretching across Europe. To her, it was the reenactment of her parents' marriage, Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, and Henry VIII. A powerful Catholic alliance could secure England's faith for eternity. Yet to her subjects, the decision seemed nothing less than placing the kingdom into foreign hands. The vision of a Spanish king sitting on England's throne spread fear, loss of sovereignty, loss of identity, and above all, being dragged into wars, not their own. As soon as the wedding was announced, opposition flared. Many whispered that Mary had betrayed England. And then, in early 1554, that discontent exploded into Wyatt's rebellion. Thomas Wyatt the Younger, a nobleman of Kent, gathered thousands of soldiers, raised the banner against the marriage to Philip, and called for Mary to be replaced by Elizabeth, youthful, Protestant, and more purely English in the eyes of the people. The rebel army marched toward London. But at the gates, they were stopped, and it was Mary herself who created an immortal moment. Instead of fleeing, she donned armor, mounted a white horse, stood before the people at Guildhall, and declared words recorded in history that she feared not death for honor and for God, and if necessary, she would sacrifice herself to defend her crown. That image, a middle-aged woman, small in stature, yet brave enough to face an entire rebel army, stirred the hearts of Londoners. They turned against Wyatt. The rebellion quickly collapsed. Wyatt was captured and executed, and Mary kept her throne. Yet that victory brought another cost. Elizabeth was suspected of involvement in the plot. The younger sister, the potential heir, now loomed as a greater threat than ever. Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very chamber that had once held her mother, Anne Boleyn. Before execution, Mary could have signed the death warrant, but she hesitated. Perhaps out of mercy, perhaps from fear of another civil war, Elizabeth escaped death. But the bond between the sisters fell into a state of tension and suspicion, a ticking time bomb at the heart of the court. The wedding with Philip took place on July 25th, 1554. The two had met only 2 days earlier. The ceremony was magnificent. Yet in the eyes of many subjects, it was not the dawn of a glorious reign, but a sign that England was about to become a vassal of Spain. Mary, however, believed that God had granted her a husband to help build a new Catholic dynasty. She did not know that this very marriage would lead to the most humiliating tragedies of her life. Soon after her wedding with Philip, news spread throughout the court. Mary was pregnant. The court erupted with joy. The people prayed day and night. All of Europe waited anxiously for the birth of an English prince, one who would bind the kingdom's future to the powerful Habsburg bloodline. Mary was overjoyed. She believed God had answered her prayers, that her years of disgrace were finally being redeemed. She even summoned Elizabeth to court to witness the great event, the birth of a Catholic heir, who would forever push Elizabeth aside from the throne. Yet the due date came and went. There was no infant's cry. No prince was born. Mary's belly was swollen. But no child came forth. The entire court, all of Europe, all of England, were stunned. After months of silence, Mary was forced to emerge from her chamber and face the truth. It had only been a false pregnancy. A collapse not only of the body, but of the spirit. To her subjects, she became a laughingstock. To Philip, the young and distant husband, it was reason enough to leave her and return to Spain. Mary was so tormented, she became obsessed. When her belly swelled again, she once more believed herself with child. But again came disappointment. Now, many historians believe Mary may have suffered from ovarian cancer, causing her body to mimic the symptoms of pregnancy. In despair at having no heir, Mary clung ever tighter to the Catholic faith. She believed that only by purging the Protestant heresy would God grant her a miracle. And so the pyres began to rise across England. From the year 1555, the anti-heresy laws were reinstated. Those who rejected Catholicism were sentenced to burn at the stake. At first, Mary thought that by executing a few stubborn figures, the rest would fear and return to the church. But reality proved otherwise. The Protestant faith, instead of being extinguished, blazed even brighter. Within only 3 years, more than 280 people, men, women, even children, were sent to the flames. They died in agony, but also in the belief that their blood would nourish a Protestant England of the future. Those horrifying scenes burned themselves into the collective memory of the people, and thus the name Bloody Mary was born, a nickname that clung to the Queen, turning her into a symbol of cruelty in history. Mary, in her heart, believed she was doing what was right, that she was saving the souls of her nation. But to her people, all that remained was blood and fire. At the same time, she lived in loneliness. Philip kept his distance, returning to England only briefly when he needed to draw the country into Habsburg wars. With no children, no love, no support, Mary fell into ever deeper decline, both physically and spiritually. By the late 1550s, as her health visibly failed, Mary knew death was near. But the greatest pain was not death itself, but the cruel truth the crown would pass to Elizabeth, the Protestant sister she had tried so hard to displace. At the end of the 1550s, Mary's health collapsed swiftly. She suffered constant stomach pains, exhaustion, vomiting. More and more believed she had cancer of the ovary or womb, the same that had caused her haunted false pregnancies. But to courtiers and subjects, her illness bore another meaning, a sign of God's judgment. Whispers spread. The Queen's weakness meant the kingdom too was in decline. Those who once praised her began to turn away. They quietly left court for Hatfield, where Elizabeth resided. All could see clearly Mary's sun was setting, and a new dawn was rising in her sister. Meanwhile, the marriage with Philip became a wound that never healed. He was almost never with Mary, returning only when he needed to draw England into Habsburg conflicts. The love Mary bore Philip was fervent, but what she received in return was coldness, indifference. The woman who had once boldly faced a rebel army and declared she would die for her country was now only a lonely figure in the palace, nursing the sorrow of abandonment. By early 1558, her illness grew dire. Mary was so weak she could scarcely appear before her court. Her attendants whispered of succession. She knew she had no child. And Elizabeth, the Protestant sister, was the unavoidable choice. On November 17th, 1558, Mary Tudor breathed her last at the age of 42. No husband by her side, no heir to follow, only a court impatiently awaiting Elizabeth's coronation. The transfer of power took place more smoothly than anyone expected. Elizabeth, together with her secretary Robert Cecil, had prepared carefully. There was no riot, no blood spilled. In that moment, a new era officially began, the 45-year reign of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who would defeat the Spanish Armada and open the golden age of English literature, art, and politics. History often portrays the two sisters as polar opposites: Mary, Bloody Mary, Elizabeth, Gloriana. Yet in truth, Elizabeth inherited more of Mary's legacy than people imagine. It was Mary who laid the legal foundation for a queen to rule on equal footing with men, the first to declare that a queen could be the mother of the nation. Elizabeth only needed to follow that path and turn it into glory. Today, in Westminster Abbey, Mary and Elizabeth lie side by side in a shared tomb. Two sisters once opposed, once adversaries, now rest together in silence. A reminder that history remembers not only victories, but also the tragedies that paved the way for them. And perhaps, if we listen more closely, we will realize both Mary and Elizabeth, each in her own way, proved that a woman could weigh justice, steer a nation, and leave a mark no less than any king. Two sisters, two queens, two symbols, opposite yet reflecting one another. Mary, a woman who all her life longed to be loved, longed for a child, longed to leave behind a Catholic dynasty, but received only rejection, humiliation, and the nickname Bloody Mary that history forever tied to her name. Elizabeth, the girl once deemed a bastard, living in the shadow of her executed mother, who rose to become Gloriana, bringing England glory through victory, culture, and art. Yet if we look closely, we see Elizabeth could not have gained that brilliance without Mary. It was Mary, through her tragedy and her determination, who paved the way for the acceptance of a ruling queen in a patriarchal society. It was Mary, through blood and tears, who proved that a woman could sit upon the throne, though the price she paid was her entire life. Those two sisters, in the end, lie together in Westminster Abbey, sharing one tomb, sharing the memory of a nation. And perhaps, when we look upon it, we recognize a simple truth. History is never only black and white, never only the cruel and the glorious. History is a mirror of interwoven fates, where the tragedy of one becomes the foundation of another's triumph. Mary and Elizabeth, two faces, two Destinias, but of the same Tudor blood, proved that even when called the weaker sex, women could make history, shape a nation, and leave behind a legacy lasting for centuries.